Most of us got through some of the pop culture. I think we'll just start here for as a point of reference, place to begin. So remember, huge expansion of the middle class in the 1950s. A third of whom were living in the suburbs, conformity, affluence, consumer culture, leaving millions behind in the inner city in poverty, mostly the minority groups left behind in the urban centers. So 1950, we mentioned a few stats. First, plastic credit card. 1955, we see there Disneyland and many strip malls, big malls, to support the affluence and the conformity and the shopping of the consumer culture developed throughout suburbia, as does McDonald's. 1954, first located outside Chicago. It's a suburban setting, of course. And the explosion of TVs, 7 million in the United States in 1950, 55 million TV sets by 1961. So similar to the radio in the 20s, we have the television for the 1950s. Virtually every American home had a TV by the end of the decade, with some exception, of course. And TV dinners emerge. You can literally buy your dinner at the store, 3 courses, throw it in the oven, take it out, sit in front of the TV, and watch your favorite shows, which you can see a place for the family to come together after work. And we went over the shows from after the fact with Lucy, The Honeymooners, a lot of comedies, many shows depicting ideal American life for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant writers. Typical American family there for Leave It to Beaver, mom, dad, 2 to 3 kids. This spawned a spin-off shown here, Lassie, and later on. But any questions with TV and the after the fact reading we can cover during our quick review. But key to note, most of them enforce the mother being in the home, women going back to the kitchen. Even those TV dinners were marketed to women to make their lives seemingly easier and less dull and boring in the conformity of the suburbs. Here we see the king and meeting the President Nixon to show the extent of his popularity and power. Rock and roll emerges during this time. The name there is Alan Freed, like free with a D at the end, Alan Freed. Disc jockey from Cleveland, first used the term. He had noticed white teens buying R&B records and played them on the radio, and then applied that an African American term for dancing and sex, rock and roll, to the new music that was emerging throughout the 1950s. And Elvis's gyrating hips attracted many and raised a few eyebrows along the way, scaring many traditionalists, as did Marilyn Monroe, and other publications coming out at that time. So we have a rebellious youth again in the 1950s, defined here as the beatniks. So a term to describe the younger generation pushing back. Remember, in the 50s here especially, this is the limited minority, small exception to the conformity rule. Most teenagers were dressing like Richie Cunningham and his friends with the short sleeve plaid shirts, conformity in the suburbs, being square, quote unquote, following the rules, doing what they were told, being like everyone else. But there was a small group that started to push back and reject the materialism and reject the conformity of the day. Small in number, but advocated for spontaneity, drug use, rebellion. And we see 2 of the prime examples there, Kerouac and Salinger, who inspired that generation to push back against authority and then grow in number in the 1960s, paving the way for a massive youth rebellion that we'll get to in the next chapter. The beat in the beatnik name is a Kerouac term, referencing a generation that's beat down from all the conformity and affluence and the boring suburban life. And Nicks, anything Nick, was a reference to Sputnik, and anything associated or that received that name, Nick, was communist, un-American, a derogatory term. Combined with beat, it describes that generation again, that looked to push back from the norm. So remember, in the 1920s we had the Lost Generation, 1930s Great Depression and despair, breakdown of the family unit. The 40s, the greatest generation, off to fight and win World War II. The 50s, then, the beatniks, a small portion, again, small minority, which will develop and blossom into the hippies of the counterculture, the youth movement, rebellious protesting movement of the 1960s. And with that, we'll end up quickly here with just a bit on Eisenhower's legacy. In 1962, he was ranked 22nd of in all-time presidents, a little better than Andrew Johnson. By 2009, however, history had revisited and actually given Eisenhower promotion, ranking 8th in 2009, third of the last 75 years, behind FDR number 1 and Truman number 2, and then Eisenhower comes in number 3, and that's a 2009 statistic. And remember, the early criticism was that Grandpa golfed and fished, and that he was a part-time president. He wasn't involved in presidential decisions. That proved to be untrue, but he did have a tendency to obfuscate the issues when appropriate with the media, as shown here, meaning hidden, kind of confused, fractured syntax, where he would just confuse people if the administration had no clear guide or no clear policy in place. So we later learned that fishing and golfing part-time grandpa was really a hidden hand presidency. More on that later. Some other criticisms of Eisenhower developed later on. And one is that he extends the Cold War unnecessarily into the Third World, failing many times, we have mentioned, to distinguish between nationalist movements within these developing Third World nations, confusing those nationalist movements with communism, and Lebanon would be the prime example that we use there. Other criticism of Eisenhower are that he failed to halt the militarization of U.S. foreign policy and domestic life, and the creation of the military-industrial complex, which we'll see him warn against on his during his farewell address. And really, some historians say that Eisenhower bears responsibility for the tragedies of the 1970s, late 1960s and 70s, as the issues he left on the table for future presidents to deal with explode into controversy and sometimes into tragedy. Remember, regarding civil rights, one of the criticisms, he's more concerned with social harmony and social justice. And the federal intervention at Little Rock is the best example for that. So no moral crusade for civil rights, no enforcement of Brown. Remember, we believe that decision changed or challenged the generations of culture, and that change was in the hearts and minds, which was required to eliminate the problem. Hearts and minds of the people, not legislation. But there was some movement on civil rights. Remember the two acts, 57 and 60, the first since Reconstruction first president to use the federal troops to protect African Americans and establishing that Civil Rights Commission. So there was some success there. Other criticisms and success would be his covert operations, his love of covert operations, which yielded short-term gains but long-term losses, as we said, leaving many issues for future presidents to decide. And then let's look at some positives. What does Eisenhower get credit for? Well, one, remember, as soon as he came into office, he ended the Korean conflict during Truman's lame duck term. He did end up, in the end, placing sharp limitations on defense spending. The military budget did decrease during his time, slightly towards the end. And he was successful at containment without bloodshed and an exorbitant amount of money. So he did show restraint and an astute political acumen in foreign policy and dealing with complex foreign policy issues, which he was proud of, as he said in the end, that he was very proud that no lives were lost during his presidency. Um, so he gets credit. He gets credit for that, handling the Cold War and handling containment very well abroad. And successful at checking communist aggression within and without. Um, let's see. We have other benefits for Eisenhower. The first arms limitations by the United States, unilaterally, voluntarily suspending above ground nuclear testing, which will lead to international agreements to do the same later on. And that's in 1958 by President Eisenhower. Let's not forget his Atoms for Peace project that did um, help many developing nations in the immediate term. Um, he 1959's Man of the Year, admired, respected throughout. People loved Grandpa Ike, and he remained aggressive in his last 2 years, despite a democratically controlled Congress with 169 vetoes from 55 to 61, which were only overridden twice. So admired by the people, admired by the legislative branch, or as well, and he presided over a very prosperous 8 years, adding two new states. We get to 50 states in 1959, as you know, with Alaska in January and Hawaii in August of that year, 1959. So here's his advice on the way out the door, warning the nation to guard against the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. He knew and was well aware that the spending on the military could grow into a power the United States that potentially could not keep in check and would bankrupt the system. Remember our NSC 162, which warned against Eisenhower's biggest fear regarding how the United States could lose the Cold War. So with unprecedented candor really throughout, Eisenhower was clear in saying that war was the last resort, and he was proud to say that at the end. And here we are, 1959. We have the two states added. He does go out with Man of the Year honors. And that should do it for the Hidden Hand president. In the end, not so part-time, more hidden hand, where he was guiding policy while letting advisors to think and be creative and take the credit for the successes, while he was more than prepared to take the heat, as the U2 incident showed us, where he addressed the world and took responsibility for that, what amounted to a lie in the end. So that will do it for this round of the Cold War. We will review, go over any questions, and prepare for our DBQ when we get back to class on Wednesday.